Shane Kilkelly.
And I'm Kyle Thompson.
And you're listening to General Intellect Unit. And we're back after our winter break.
Yes.
Indeed. Bit of the traditional winter slowdown. But we're back in action. It's a whole new year. Whole new year of nightmares yet to come. Yeah, fucking hell. Oh boy, what a December.
Oh
no.
Oh boy. I feel like, well, I guess we already had a separate discussion about that on Alpha to Omega.
Yeah.
But yeah, I feel for you. Big time.
Mm-hmm. Oh well, onward and upward and so on. This time we are kicking off the year with a special episode. Kyle went to New Zealand to interview some folks. Kyle, who are these people? What's this episode about?
Right. So a very winter themed episode here because we're in the middle of summer here in New Zealand. But I went to the End Spiral Dev Academy in Wellington, New Zealand, and met up with three members of the Loomio decision making software cooperative. So talked to them about their history as an organization that kind of emerged out of Occupy. That emerged out of this larger sort of social organization, End Spiral, and what lessons they've learned, what challenges they've faced as a self-managed organization. Also managed to kind of bring some discussion of the VSM and how it's relevant to their experiences in there. And so, yeah, I think anybody who's interested in any kind of self-organization and any kind of like applied VSM stuff, or just like in any kind of mutualist enterprise, cooperative, what have you, I think you'll find this discussion quite interesting.
Indeed. And I guess without further ado, on to the interview. Okay, so I am here at the End Spiral Dev Academy with some worker owners of Loomio. Care to introduce yourselves?
Hi, I'm Michael Elwood-Smith. I'm a director of the cooperative and a worker member. I've been with the company for just on 7 years now.
My name's John Guerin. I have my eyes laser focused on group success, as we call it at Loomio. I've been with the co-op for a bit over a year. Also worker owner.
I'm Gregory Kahn, and I am one of the developers. And I've been in Loomio for about the same amount of time as John. Almost 2 years. Yeah.
Great. Okay. So my first question for you is, what is Loomio?
Yeah, great question. So what Loomio is today and what Loomio was when it started out, it's still very much what it was. Loomio is a worker-owned cooperative. It's a social enterprise. It has a particular mission and purpose to help people be involved in decisions that affect them. It is primarily a software company and also an open source software company, as was established from the beginning. And in terms of what kind of company, which is, I guess, where our questions have evolved over the time, is we are a for-profit company in the instance of being a cooperative and an enterprise. We have the mission to reinvest our profits back into ventures and opportunities that help to further the mission of the cooperative. We are and remain primarily a software company. And a couple of the members that we'll talk about probably as we go through this call are still Loomio cooperative members, but they're also doing consultancy work, because we found over time that developing and talking about self-managed organizations, which I guess was a term that's come even since we originally formed about 8 years ago, certainly decentralized organizations, is something that is both a culture as well as a practice. So something that people needed to explore and consider how they would go about doing that. And then a software tool, which allows you to actually put that into practice in your organization.
Right, so Loomio is both the name of this cooperative and also the name of your main product. Yeah.
Correct, of the software, yeah.
All right, great. And just for people who are considering forming a cooperative, I was wondering what the actual legal entity of Loomio is. Is it an LLC? What is it?
Yeah, in New Zealand, Loomio is a registered limited liability company, which is equivalent to, LLC.
Okay.
And but we're registered as a cooperative. And so it is a formal registration in law, in company law, and once a year the board need to declare that they are still operating as a cooperative and with cooperative principles. And as part of that, we have a constitution, which is a cooperative-based constitution.
I see. So there's a little bit of separation of the legal registration and then the cooperative registration of the entity.
Separated but linked. Yeah.
Right, yes. Okay, excellent. Okay, good to know. It's very different across jurisdictions what cooperatives end up being, so I was interested in getting that on the record there. Okay, so can you talk a little bit more about what Loomio, the software product, is?
Mm-hmm. So Loomio is a tool that supports group collaboration. Can be useful for all kinds of different groups, from companies to volunteer organizations, member-driven organizations, whether those are co-ops or even different political organizations have used the tool. And we see it being used in a lot of different ways, but a lot of it boils down to how do you start and hold conversations that move towards clear outcomes? And oftentimes that looks like action or collective action. Other times that looks like shared understanding. There's, certain government projects and more formal boards that are wanting to have just like a really nice record and be able to look back, hey, why did we make that decision? Or, oh, that's not working. What were those alternatives we considered? So Loomio is kind of like many discussion forums you might have seen, but our innovation is that we have really honed the platform to drive those discussions towards a named and explicit, here's where we got to. And that's primarily through, we have proposals in polls, which we call decision tools, but we're also even more calling facilitation tools these days, because we kind of have realized it's not always necessary to call it a decision even. Sometimes your group just really needs to have a good conversation and leave that with a better understanding of where everybody's at. And stuff that you can use to move the group forward. So we see a lot of groups using it for remote work for sure, but even groups that are co-located but it definitely helps people organize across time and space. So groups that can't meet up in person, where meetings are more expensive, Loomio can save them meetings even. We've heard customers report back to us. So.
Okay, yeah. So I'll just hook on to that a little bit. So you're quite a distributed cooperative, is that correct, in terms of your membership?
Well, we have a small membership. In fact, currently there are only 8 members. And as a worker-owned cooperative, our membership has fluctuated because it's important to us that the people who are engaged in the work are actually in the voting position, if you like, of controlling the direction of the company. But yeah, currently, even of those small members, we have 3 of our cooperative members are offshore, 2 currently in Italy and 1 in Rhode Island in the US.
Okay. So I know, for example, in Canada, that would pose a major challenge for a cooperative, because there's a requirement that the majority board members be residents of Canada. Did you have any challenges of that sort here?
Well, we have our board has currently got 3 local residents of New Zealand and 2 which are offshore, one in Germany and one in the US. It doesn't cause a problem from a government perspective, from a legal perspective, but it can cause challenges from financial, particularly the banks and the control and these things like foreign accounts and so forth. And
right.
Who's got the controlling interests?
And did you have any sort of problems with like banks not recognizing your status as a corporation? No,
because we're registered here in New Zealand and we operate globally.
Okay, great. So Loomio has a relationship with another entity called Enspiral, right, which owns this dev academy that we're located at right now. Can you talk a little bit about what that relationship is?
I'll start to begin with, and then I'll pass to John to fill in a lot of the gaps. So Enspiral is a collective network of several hundreds of people across the world, of people trying to do work for good, or good work, essentially. And of that, it is a mixture of individuals and ventures. And some of these ventures have started from within Enspiral, and Loomio was one of the first ventures that was started within Enspiral. And its formation came from a group of people that were originally in the Occupy movement, actually meeting up with technology developers and cultural developers in the Enspiral community that formed the first version of Loomio.
Right, I see. So the sort of techniques of self-management and organization from Occupy were kind of an inspiration for Loomio at the start.
They were, and it also was the same kind of the self-management, collective decision-making was very much of the mind of Enspiral and collective in the early days. And so Enspiral really was the first customer of Loomio.
Got it.
They were, as the software was being developed, across the shoulders, people would say, hey, this is broken, or, we should have this feature or whatever. And so it was really developed alongside the Enspiral network community.
I see. Okay, great. So now Loomio itself, does it function as one big team, or is it divided into a collection of subsystems or subgroups, like working groups that you use?
Yeah, we have. We use so within Loomio we have Loomio structured as a cooperative, so that's all of the workers are able to see what's going on at the transparent level. But then we have working groups. So, for example, we have a product development working group. We have a customer success working group, which is focused on how do we ensure success of customers. We have a communications working group. And on each of those groups, we are quite often bringing in people outside of Loomio, the cooperative, as well. So you quite often see a blended operation. But primarily we're organized around the function of the work that we're doing.
Right. So obviously you have quite a small membership here, but you've still found that the working group model is functional. It works towards the aims of the cooperative as a whole.
Yeah, very much so. Because we have our own specialties and experiences in particular areas. So it makes sense to have people working at their strengths and able to work quickly. And the working groups are perhaps the most effective way that we've found to progress work quickly. It also allows much more agility in the group. And all of these working groups are also operating transparently, so that activity that's happening, for example, in the comms group if Greg was to see something come up that we were doing in comms that he had a problem with, for example, and from a development perspective, he could sing out and be involved, at that point. But he doesn't have to be involved in the daily working of that comms team.
All right, fantastic. I think that really synchronizes quite a lot with the stuff we've talked about on the show already regarding Stafford Beer's viable system model of how these things can work together. That's very, very interesting. So yeah, you mentioned agility. And Loomio, does Loomio operate on an agile model or with agile principles, I should say?
Yeah, kind of with our own version of it.
Okay. That's probably the best kind, is the one that's actually suited to your organization.
Yeah, I'd probably say purists, from an agile perspective, will look at what we're doing and say, oh, that's not really agile. And similarly, purists of lots of different things. But so we run 2-week sprints. Okay. And what we found most importantly, and this is something that maybe of help, is that we found that developing rhythms of work is perhaps the most important thing, because then we get into rhythms and patterns, and we know, and these are the points where we come together. So today, with a small team, and we've run this more formal in the past, but today with a smaller team, we are running 2 weekly sprints. So we start the sprint with a sprint planning work, where we look at the work that's coming in. It's our opportunity to check in together, but also to challenge each other about, can this work be done in this time? Is this the right work to be done in the next 2 weeks? Quite often we're agreeing and even pushing some work back, to a later sprint, because as priorities change, then what appeared to be important in 1 week is not necessarily as important the next week, or we've learned some new information. And then we run through that 2 weeks. We're checking in as a small team on a daily basis as well as that progresses. In a week's time, we have another mid-sprint check-in where we look at the work, particularly for any blocks that are coming in, anything that we can do to unblock those. And then at the end of the sprint, we have a kind of mini retro where we look back at the week and a demo of the work that we have done, particularly that needs to be shown to the rest of the team.
Okay. Yeah, so you talked sort of about the importance of cadences and rhythms to your work. Do you think that has anything to do with this being a process of self-management versus something you might see in like a traditional capitalist firm with management coming from the top down?
I do find, across, and I've worked in a consulting capacity as well, doing kind of organizational capacity development or capacity growth. And I do find with more self-organizing teams that having an explicit cadence that people have agreed to, it's rather than somebody saying this is when we're going to have it, it's rather like, no, we've created a drum beat, and that means that none of us have to be kind of the coercive element or also just the nag, right? People get busy, and being really tired at the end of a day, and you're like, oh, I've got to go to this meeting. Sometimes it's nice to have that established already. Like, as a team, this is where we can set up some systems that are going to push us to be our best team self, I guess.
Right.
I think also the fact of regular communication between the different working groups. I'm sure people are familiar with the term of being siloed off from each other, which happens in a traditional hierarchical organization. I think it's important to know what each other member is doing, like each one else, like what everyone else is doing.
Right. Yeah. Right. And so there is that coordination dimension of checking in on the sprints, doing triage together, that kind of thing. That's important there.
And I think we've really found the value of that rhythm. There are times when we sort of look at each other and think, oh, should we meet together? We all know what we're doing. We're totally into the work. And then we make the time and we do meet and we find new stuff, that emerges from that meeting. And we realize, oh yeah, that was important that we took this time out to do this. And sometimes, sometimes things change quite rapidly. And I know, John, you've experienced this before, that, what started off at the beginning of the month to be an important job, suddenly is being deprioritized because something else has come up that we needed to really focus on. And if we're not meeting regularly with that rhythm, you risk losing context, and therefore, your response to that could be, "Oh, my work is not valued," which is not the case. It's that the work has shifted in a way, and that by being along with that journey, that we know that we need to take a slight change in direction.
Right. So just speaking to that a little bit, like if the project you've been working on has been deprioritized temporarily or perhaps more long-term, what kind of structures do you have for somebody in that position to speak up about their feelings regarding that? To be heard.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think it's those weekly rhythms primarily, and then I'll name that growing up with Inspiral, it's interesting to see Inspiral and Loomio and all the ventures around us typically use check-ins, which is just some time at the top of the meeting to share what's on top for you, how you're feeling, and typically doesn't have a time limit, so it's really space for any airing of whatever needs to be said. So I think that's one thing that we've done pretty well, is preserving those spaces. And I think one thing that we've kind of recommitted to in the last year is having the retrospectives, what's going well, what could be better, what are some specific changes we might want to make, and just having time for that, to just do that continuous improvement.
Great. So that kind of brings up an interesting point, which is what does Loomio do to understand its environment, to plan for the future? I mean, you've mentioned retrospectives; those are always useful for that sort of thing. But aside from the sort of day-to-day project management and development, and just getting the work done, what kind of venues do you have for looking at what's going on in your market, for what you might need to plan for ahead, what your operating situation is?
Yeah, we so every day we're in contact with our customers as the primary customers and users of Loomio every day, and even if some people don't hear from us very, very often, we're talking with people every day. And I'd say that's the primary way, because that tends to be an online chat to begin with, and then many times we're doing direct interviews with customers. John is reaching out as part of his customer success story to connect particularly with our new paying customers, about how to help them get started and to understand their environment. Okay. So we're able to hear from and our customers are generous. They tell us, what it is that they're struggling with, what problem has led them to come to look at a tool like Loomio, what they're trying to achieve, and we learn a lot about what's happening in organizations through that, which helps us to improve and bring that into what our new feature development should be, for example. Right. And where the priorities should be. In addition to that, as being part of a network like Inspiral, I would add further that we feel nurtured in this network. So the hundreds of folks that are out in the wider network of Inspiral, like our eyes and ears out into the marketplace as well, connecting with organizations and people, often change makers, people looking at new trends. We have good networks with consultant groups and many many organizations really that are out doing new things. And I've just actually come from a lunch with one of our friends that works in a local NGO, nonprofit, and talking about and hearing some of the challenges really of how a nonprofit organization is dealing with self-management, and more to the case that people are more scared of it than anything, and more comfortable in their existing structures. So I'd say it's a combination of online chats, in-person interviews, and customer contact.
Right.
I think one along with that is doing some collaborations and regularly trying experiments of how do we work with, from a kind of more business perspective, we might call them channel partners, but just collaborators, the different consultants. We had a really nice collaboration with Round Sky Solutions this year and produced a really nice guide on consent-based decision-making, a particular variation of it that Round Sky calls integrative consent. We had a nice collaboration with the team that worked with Inspiral to publish the Better Work Together book that Inspiral published. And so they've just launched Better Work Together Academy, and we've hosted an event through them. So these are kind of ways that keep us regularly in contact with folks and kind of, doing sense making with other people. But I think one thing that I wanted to name too alongside that is we continue to invest a little bit in social media too to hear things. But then that sense making, it's not just happening in our meetings, and we also have rhythms around quarterly planning and doing an annual retreat, again, just creating space. Okay. But also we have Loomio. So we're doing some asynchronous conversation kind of all through and through, which is a useful kind of steady collective intelligence that's humming in the background. So, for example, we have what we call the workers wall, which is just one Loomio thread where, we drop kind of things that may not fit into any specific conversation happening right now. We have another one that's what are other technologies in our field doing? Kind of looking at competitors or potential collaborators, etc. So we do have that going, kind of ongoing sense making as well.
Okay, great. So so I guess this is kind of the sort of stuff that the VSM would classify as System 4, right? This is looking out into the environment, making sense of that, and it's really interesting that it's you can see that it's happening at the kind of interpersonal level, synchronously and asynchronously, and then also through the connections of collaborators, and then also through the sort of collective intelligence of Inspiral. That's a really interesting variety of sources to see. Great. So you've mentioned that Loomio is a venture of Inspiral. Can you just describe what a venture is?
I guess a venture is that its genesis was with Inspiral, that it is, I guess, born out of the Inspiral network. And as a venture, it is a group of people that have come together and committed to each other to build a business around that. So a venture, in this sense, means a business essentially.
Okay.
And almost all of the ventures in Inspiral have a purpose. So they are probably closer to the social enterprise end of the spectrum than they would be to hard businesses. Yeah.
Okay. Great. That's interesting. And is there a specific form of legal entity in New Zealand that is a social venture, or is that not so much a thing?
No, we don't have that, and yet we are preparing right now for B Corp certification. But no, New Zealand is pretty straightforward. It's just you're either a for-profit company with the extension of being a cooperative, if you are that, or you're a charity, a non-profit. There's no real easy middle ground for a social enterprise. But there is some work that's been going on to explore whether that is a good thing to do or not.
Right. Yeah, I know it's been the case for some years that kind of thing exists in the UK. So I just thought I would ask about that. Situation in Canada is kind of similar to here. All right. So one other thing I wanted to talk about is Co-Budget. So it's another tool that has been developed through Nspiral. Is that correct? And do you use that tool here at Loomio at all?
We have, but we don't use it directly within Loomio.
Okay, I see.
Present. But yeah, no, we've, and certainly in the Nspiral network, have been using Co-Budget.
I see.
And mainly because we don't have the need so much within the cooperative, within Loomio.
Okay, so what is the origin of not needing it? What competencies and capacities do you have as a cooperative that mean that you don't need to use Co-Budget?
Primarily, the budget, I suppose, is being developed as we go. It is a collaborative process that we're going, but that we're using. But we're not allocating spending, if you like, to individual members to budget into that. We are more specific about how the budget needs to operate according to our staffing needs, our hosting needs, and then what we're spending on communications and market growth work. So it's a little bit more traditional in that sense, as opposed to a pool of money of which we're collectively spending for a variety of different projects.
Right.
Well, yes and no. I think the thing with Co-Budget is the only thing actually that it has that the Loomio has a dot voting tool, which you can also do budgeting with, right? Like an allocate tool.
Right.
Is that you can give people to have proportionally bigger vote in where the budget goes. So you could have one person who has 3 times the vote as somebody else. And so we also don't really come up. I mean, when we do come up against that situation, it's easier to do more organically in the room, or we don't. Co-Budget's particularly good if you have quite a number of people and there's a variable spend for each person.
Okay.
So that's not been our need.
So there's essentially an organization like Nspiral has a larger membership. It deals with more variety, and so having a tool with a little bit more fine-grained ability to adapt is helpful there. But here it's equal votes, and a traditional budgeting process is working for you.
Yeah, a mixture of traditional budgeting and consent-based decision-making, I would say.
Right.
Yeah, there's not very much traditional stuff we do. But
I guess that's a relative term.
Yeah. Cooperative budgeting.
Cooperative budgeting, yes, that's good.
It kind of falls into our patterns a little bit. Our budgeting tends to be quarter by quarter, and we do have an annual budget approval that we do with cooperative members and with our shareholders. But other than that, we're effectively monitoring and managing that on a quarter by quarter basis.
Okay.
And we also need to have stability in budget as well, because it's not changing every 5 minutes.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think just kind of building on that a little bit, one major concern for cooperatives is that at some point people are going to cut and run. They're just going to take their shares, take the profits, and leave. So that presents problems for budgetary stability, right? How have you addressed that concern here in your constitution and that sort of thing?
Yeah, so that's addressed in our constitution, and that so both Greg and John are relatively recent members to Loomio, and they've deposited their $1 for the share, and so we've separated our share. The control, if you like, the controlling the voting interest in the company from the value of the company. So collectively, we control the value that's created within the company, but individually, none of us benefit from selling our share. Our share only has $1 now and only $1 in the future.
Right. So there's kind of a firewall between the cooperative assets and the ownership. Is that correct?
Not so much a firewall, is more that it's almost like a different class.
Okay.
So that cooperative shares represent controlling stake in the company. They don't represent a portion of the value of the company.
I see.
But collectively, we control that value of the company. So we can decide, for example, that from surplus, and we're not in a significant surplus place yet, so it's still theoretical a little bit, but we can control that surplus, for example, we could do a distribution out to members. We have historical members that have been involved, and we would like to recognize their contributions in the past. We have obligations to shareholders, and then when we're done with all of that, we can look at either collectively increasing salaries or paying bonuses. We can also look at using surplus to invest in new ventures, or even create a charitable foundation if we believe that that's a way to support the funds. But the advantage of this cooperative structure means that Greg and John can join for $1. They're not having to pay $100,000 or whatever to buy into the company. Right. And equally, when they leave, they're only going to get $1 back. So yes. So there's no sort of golden handcuff sitting there to hold people if in a place that they don't feel that they should be anymore.
Right. So that makes entry easier, but it also makes exit easier in a way.
It does.
Right. Because in addition to the value, there's also the matter that it's not going to produce conflict to leave the firm if your share is $1. Yeah. Okay, great. One big question that I have, we've kind of touched on this a little bit in terms of sort of consent-based decision-making, but how do you build and maintain trust among fellow worker owners here?
I think I might start with this and then invite for you guys to offer your views on this as well. I think it's a combination of almost everything we've just talked about. So firstly, it starts with being clear about our values, of holding integrity, of being open with each other, of sharing the ups and the downs, of how we feel, of dealing with issues as they arise rather than let them fester and run. So back to our patterns again, the check-ins that John mentioned, of practicing that both in person and online, of taking time out for our retreats to talk about issues, that are larger, hopes and dreams, as well as problems, that we face as we go through, what is still a long-term startup play, and developing, good personal relationships as well. I mean, at the end of the day, we're all working here because we like the people, we like the work, we love our customers, and we're doing what we're working in our strengths, in a place that we believe in. So, that's what builds, in my view, trust and engagement, in the workplace. Nobody's here saying, "Oh, you're 5 minutes late to work," or "You didn't do that thing," or whatever. Or so we have ways of working that through before they become a problem.
Okay.
Yeah, naming care. I mean, I think that's been something for us this year with some challenging circumstances. And it's everything from Loomio family Christmas party to, it was nice to come into Loomio where the team had already gone and developed some conflict transformation guidelines and protocols as well. And I was actually working with Inspiral before I joined Loomio and had actually participated in Spiral developing what we ended up calling a personal conduct agreement and conflict transformation guide, and as well as a harassment and abuse policy. And we actually referenced a lot of what Loomio had done at the time. So it was nice to be part of that conversation asynchronously, almost in a way, or like kind of participate with that content. And then that's, I think, informed how we've handled bumps in the road today. And that's definitely a trust building thing to be able to, we can have hard conversations and still move forward and grow together, and see conflict as an opportunity, and recognize that we're going to have different perspectives, and being a small company that's still trying to really get to a level of like big stability, so to speak, that sometimes communication falters, or like humans are humans, and relationships are relationships. So being able to hold that messiness, and then have a beer at the end of a sprint or something like this, that sort of stuff. Having the personal as well as the professional, and being willing to talk through that stuff, and then also just connect.
Right.
I don't think I have much to add. I think I want to talk about, I think you guys covered a lot of the formal mechanisms that help, but I think I might point to some of the more contingent ones as well. We're still really small, so we have the kind of intimacy of scale. We're basically having a core team of 4 or 5 people. And I think when you're on that intimate scale, it's much easier to remember and retain the collective focus. And I think when you're collectively focused and everyone's working together, it's easier to maintain some of these, stable relationships and trust. It'd be interesting to see if we got a lot bigger, whether we would need to introduce more formalizations but for now.
And I think that's been the experience, eh?
Yeah, we have been bigger, and we have some of that, and we broke them down. So we have experienced a little bit of that. In fact, it's worth checking out Loomio.coop. We wrote down a number of the practices and patterns and the ways we work that we've talked about. And as we found that trust grows within the organization amongst ourselves, some of those things are less important to be quite so stringent with, and allows us to evolve, to another level, I suppose, of connection. But we also, in our next iteration, when we're a larger company, we will be looking back at those practices and processes again, and of course they help new people to come on board as well.
Right, absolutely. So I think that one major challenge that people foresee or experience when considering self-management or trying to do self-management is a lack of learned skills for dealing with conflict with collaborators, right? Because we're brought up in hierarchies. We are very used to dealing with conflict in the medium of hierarchies, and maybe it's arbitration, maybe it is finding or siloing, all these kinds of different strategies that you might find in hierarchies. John, you were talking about seeing conflict as an opportunity. Can you talk a little bit more about how you've developed strategies for that? Because I do think it is a serious challenge for people in these kinds of contexts.
Yeah, I think it's been largely interpersonal in the last stage, at least in my experience at Loomio, of just learning each other's conflict preferences, and just, I think Michael said it, of just being direct communicators and bringing the care and the candor, and just creating enough spaces with both the whole team and then just checking in with one another, to be able to surface the stuff that's maybe not the conversation you're most excited to have in your day necessarily, because that's the thing too, eh?
Yeah.
I'd add a reference to that Loomio.coop handbook again, and there's a section there called Looking After People, and there we describe a number of systems, I suppose, that we have implemented over the years that help with that. So one of them is stewarding, and the concept of stewardship, which is really important to have. It's a non-hierarchical peer buddy system, effectively, that allows you to, vent if you need to a steward. We have in the past, we don't have it currently active, but we have in the past had a well working group, which was a kind of 2 or 3 stewards that would actually focus on the well-being of people in the organisation. We looked at professional development, a conflict resolution process, and how things could begin with the conversation with the steward, develop from there, all the way through to ultimately, if need be, through mediation.
Can I bounce in?
Yeah.
I think one thing that I've seen with that stewardship piece, which has also been something that the Inspiral Network has experimented with and had implementations of, is I found a really interesting and healthy, not a gossip culture per se, but like a level of competency around talking about your experience with other people, with somebody else, and as Michael said, being able to vent and kind of just naming the healthy part of that kind of social hygiene, almost, I might say. Because I've actually had an experience with a housing collective where gossip ended up being really harmful to the group in the long run, and that group did eventually disintegrate. But I think one thing that I've noticed coming into, I guess, the working collaborations and relationships that here are centered in Aotearoa in New Zealand, and something that was maybe a bit different than when I came from the United States, from the Midwest.
Sure.
Indianapolis was a lot of my work experience. I really appreciated there's a good level of confidentiality, and like it's easy to bring, I'm having struggles with this human, and get advice and know that they're not necessarily going to judge that other person. Like I think one thing that I've seen in terms of capacities that are not just in Loomio, but like with some of our peers in other ventures and that we interact with within Inspiral Dev Academy. I actually should give a shout out to Inspiral Dev Academy, who is doing a lot of work around human skills, particularly, and really investing in that, both for their students who are coming through, naming social and emotional capacities as part of their curriculum. But they even run a monthly human skills meetup group that's like open for, I still haven't made it, but I'm intending to. And I've had good conversations with the people leading that work. But yeah, just to say that it's, I think I see a lot of that non-judgment practiced really well. I see that competency, and I think, we're learning it together in this kind of ecosystem of businesses around Loomio, around Inspiral.
Perhaps the last comment I'd just make on that, which is, I found this helpful. We're talking about adults talking with other adults. It's an adult-to-adult relationship, and you mentioned the contrast with hierarchical. Quite often that can default to a parent-child relationship.
Absolutely.
And so, the responsibility in a self-managed organization is to, respect each other and to actually interact, to listen. Listening skills, hence the check-in. One of our rules really around check-in is shutting laptops, taking respect while listening to the other person, not interrupting them. So those sort of little things that we almost take for granted now, but actually are kind of learned skills, are important in that adult-to-adult relationship, and then extending that through every way that we're interacting and calling out or trying to avoid getting into a parent-child relationship.
Yeah, absolutely. It's something I've seen in a number of organizations as well. Great. Okay. So I've kind of mentioned the VSM viable system model a couple of times in this conversation before. Is it something that you've discussed or used at all here at Loomio?
Well, I didn't know much about it, but I know that John knows more about it. But when I looked at the systems, it seemed to describe a lot of what we've been practicing and working on.
Right.
And maybe gave some names to that, but I'll let you comment on this, John.
I think the only thing that I thought of in preparation for this chat was, and I have used the tool just a little bit. I ran a workshop for a network that I was part of back in the States.
Okay.
And I think some of similar principles have shown up in terms of like double linking or feedback. And I think it's interesting to see, I think the architecture of Loomio, the tool, has both influenced how we work, and it's also come from, I think, some of this, definitely lots of folks who have given lots of generous input into how the tool was developed have been looking into sociocracy, holacracy, which certainly have lineage with cybernetics and Stafford Beer's work. And, you see some of it in how we've structured groups and subgroups within Loomio, and how I think Loomio does a really good job of enabling people to be more transparent. You can have subgroups, and it's a specific group of people who are enabled to talk in that subgroup, but other people can look in, kind of like a fishbowl.
Sure.
We also have the ability to move conversations between groups and subgroups, which creates a really interesting, you could incubate a topic within a specific working group, like comms working group might work up a plan and then bring it into a broader group.
Right.
So there's some of these dynamics around nested circles and the overlaps that I think we've kind of naturally stepped into just kind of by being in the environment with folks looking at this stuff, and also building that into our tool, which we use ourselves to move our work forward.
Sure.
Yeah.
So there's working groups can function as system one. That fishbowl principle can operate as system two, and then moving into a larger conversation is kind of like system three stuff. So that's really interesting to see. All right, so another question I had, we're getting towards the end, I promise. What are some avenues for financing co-ops that you have found useful or interesting?
Well, I guess you look at me for that one too. So I've been involved in financing Loomio from the beginning, and we've tried a lot actually through this time. So the very first, we've had 2 crowdfunding campaigns. The first was a tiny amount, local, and then the second was a larger amount, around 130,000 US, with about 1,200 donors to that, and it was pretty much in the form of donations. It wasn't equity.
Okay.
We have also taken a friends and family loan in the early days under a compounding interest, but a forgivable loan. So in the event that the company didn't move forward, we found that loans weren't really a great idea, because the very nature of them is people expect to be paid back at some point.
Yep.
And not only that, they start accruing interest. And you remember at school you learn about compound interest and how that works in your favor if you have a deposit with a bank. Well, it kind of works really against you when you're at 8% compounding, which is what we were. So $180,000, you'd be surprised, turns into $210,000 in 2 years.
Yes.
So that was kind of shocking, actually, to actually see the numbers come out. So I wouldn't recommend that. The next vehicle we used was we worked with local cooperative legal expert and Deloitte Private Finance as well to look at a model called Redeemable Preference Shares.
Okay.
Because I mentioned earlier about the cooperative structure that the worker, we've kind of separated control or the voting from the value.
Yes.
And Redeemable Preference Shares essentially means that it's a soft form of equity that allows people to buy a share in the company at a face value and then to have a right to a dividend in the future. Mm-hmm. And we specified what that dividend would be. So it's essentially a capped return equity model.
Okay.
And so that worked well. We've done 2 rounds on that, and we've raised collectively around, say, $750,000 US dollars on that model. Mm-hmm. We found it effective for individuals. Mm-hmm. But not effective at all for institutional funding because it falls outside of the remit of most funds rules.
I see.
So we've kind of considered that, and then over the last we've also had some philanthropic donations over the time as well.
Okay.
But primarily we've been focusing the last few years on building sustainable revenue through income, which of course is the best way to finance your business, to actually have customers to pay for your software. So, in the early days, Loomio was an open source software project, and totally experimental, in the first days. And then as time has gone on, we realized the value of actually being able to chart our own future, mm-hmm. and financial sustainability was a critical element to that.
Okay.
So this year we actually did a restructure where we realized that to raise next level of capital funding, we would need to come from institutions and funds, and therefore we'd have to look more traditional, mm-hmm. to an equity investor and share control and value. So we've made a restructure in the cooperative where we've moved the member controlling share out into its own company, now Loomio Cooperative, effectively a holding company, which currently owns 100% of Loomio Limited, the software company.
Sure.
And that's going to allow us next year to raise new capital funding in ordinary equity in Loomio Limited.
And so would that be publicly traded?
It'll be privately traded to begin with. But our ultimate aim, if we're successful with that round, is to do a direct public offering, and work through, and ultimately to have a hybrid model of a worker-owned cooperative plus a platform cooperative. Mm-hmm. So we're sharing effectively control and ownership between workers and customer users of Loomio.
Okay. All right. So the customer and user side, what would their involvement in that be?
Yeah. So, and this is why we can't do it right now because we just don't have the resources to be able to build this. But we would be effectively doing a direct public campaign, for this, and inviting customers and users to take a share in a segment, if you like, of the company. Okay.
So this would be, again, a different avenue of financing from the public trading or private trading. The private trading. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay. Interesting. So would that then give the customers who have bought in a certain amount of control over the direction of Loomio?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah,
right.
They have a controlling interest. So we've got a lot of work to do before mm-hmm. we're ready to get to that place. But that's where we would like to go towards. We're excited to see that in the platform cooperative space that groups like Buy Twitter, for example, have been using Loomio to have discussions to look at the kind of platforms that are out there and look at the ownership of those models.
Yes.
And consider that. And but we have so that's our vision and our goal and where we're trying to work towards. But our first steps are certainly financial stability and financial growth. and we're looking to do that through some private equity, and not private equity as a private equity company, but private placements, I suppose, with equity investors.
Yes.
With that to really grow the usage base and the customer base of Loomio, and then to look at opening that to probably 1 or 2 stages towards a platform cooperative towards that vision.
Okay. Well, we've talked. We had an episode earlier on Nick Cernicek's platform capitalism. And so it's interesting to hear about this possibility of a platform cooperative. Yes, that's very, very intriguing.
You might be interested to talk to Trevor Schultz or Nathan Schneider of the Platform Co-op Consortium.
All right.
That would be right up your alley. Yeah.
Excellent. Yeah, I'll definitely look into that. Okay. So you mentioned originally the individual investment through was a non-traditional equity model. Now, that was a fixed return that you said, right? So just like I was wondering to go back to that a little bit, if you could mention like what kinds of individuals are buying it? Is it people who want to support the co-op, or is it just like general investors like, oh, I just want to get a fixed return on an investment?
Yeah. Look, they're all people that we knew or know and connected with and supported the vision and the values and the purpose of Loomio. So, and this gave a mechanism to allow them to invest that wasn't a debt-based mechanism that we have, but at the same time was aligned with the values and the direction of the company. Right. So yeah, it's not something that was generally available, and the rules that we did it within, we were limited anyway to 20 investors in a 12-month period. So under those particular rules that we were working under, it couldn't have opened up significantly greater than that anyway. Right.
Okay. So it was kind of an alternative to the loan idea that you tried out earlier. Okay. Interesting. Okay, so what are some uses of, I guess, mainly Loomio, but perhaps other N-Spiral products for non-business groups? We kind of talked about that at the beginning of the discussion, but I was just wondering if there were some particular cases you wanted to highlight, mention as it being of interest.
I can tell one story just came up as we've been talking self-management, self-organizing, and also transparency. I was just recalling a story that really inspired me from one group. This is actually a company, but I think still endemic of like what groups stand to accomplish sometimes with taking some of their conversations or decisions online. And particularly this group was looking at how do we be more transparent, and particularly making their salaries transparent. And it was really interesting where the founder was like, I've heard that this might be a good idea. It's kind of really scary, but I'm going to see what the appetite for this is. And so was able to initiate and have this conversation with the whole company about it. And he put out, I'm going to make this decision at the end. Like, we're going to make this clear. This is my decision to make. And at the end of the consultation, everybody was like, yeah, I'd be happy for that to happen. I'd consent. And he went away and ended up deciding to do it. And they found they had a gender wage gap and were able to fix that. Okay. So that was just like really interesting to see, like something that could probably feel like a bit of an intimidating conversation to bring up in a room, perchance. They were able to do that, giving people kind of the time to digest it and think about the ramifications and share their input.
Right.
Probably a couple of quick examples. One of my favorite groups is the Zero Waste France group, over 500 people across France. And they have used Loomio over the last few years to make to organize more than 3,000 different events. And one of those events was to raise a campaign with McDonald's about removing plastic packaging. And they were successful with that. So really great just to see it used in an organizational capacity with volunteer organizations to mobilize volunteers.
Right.
Biggest example of which being locally the teachers union here, NZEI, had an engagement, one of the largest that's been run through the platform.
Yeah.
That was with one group anyway of 2,500 teachers across the country. And they were able to come together around their demands and actually decide on those demands using input that in conversation that happened on Loomio,
so
with a victory in the end.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so they because they didn't have all of their members, they couldn't use Loomio as the ballot place, but they used it as the discussion place to help educate people and discuss through the issues. And it was very, very lightly facilitated. So it was quite amazing actually from that perspective. That was fascinating. And the other example I might give too would be there's a group in Cornwall that are making decisions about funding community renewable energy projects. And they have developed a workflow process where a local community project like a school would apply for some funding, for example, to put up some solar energy on their gymnasium.
Sure.
And they would, by going through this application, there's about 15 key questions that are asked. They run a Loomio thread on each of those. They answer the questions directly into Loomio. They then, the committee then connects with the online and asks clarifying questions so that they get good answer. In some cases, ask for more information about that.
Right.
They then boot out the applicant, and then they bring in their council partner that helped provide 50% of this funding to then explore further towards making a decision. And they do this entirely on Loomio.
Right.
And they've been able to avoid meetings altogether.
Okay.
So it's just a great example of doing some good where people are short on time. They can't travel very easily to meet each other, and yet have to work through some important and financial implications of their decision making. Sure.
So I guess in the case of was it NZEI? Is that right? Now that was a feed into like a collective bargaining process.
Yes.
Yeah. Just to clarify. Okay. Interesting. And then, so that was brought to the union, and then that was brought to the table of their negotiating partner, boards of education or whatever it is. Yeah, okay. And in terms of the local funding, after the funder had talked with the organizer, would then the applicant be brought back into that conversation or outside of Loomio?
They would be advised of the outcome.
Okay.
I'm not sure if they're brought back into Loomio or not, but but what it's doing is not only providing a communication platform and an opportunity for them to connect, but a clear record really of the decisions and the discussion that led up to those decisions.
Okay. Excellent. So that transcript would be stored. Okay, that's great. All right, very interesting. One thing that I think's happened online in maybe the last decade, there's been kind of a reaction to large social media platforms like Twitter or Facebook or whatever, and people have been forming a lot of smaller affinity groups. Whether that is around a hobby, whether it is around marginalized status, mutual aid, that kind of thing. Do you see Loomio as having value for those kinds of groups as well?
Absolutely. Yeah, we see lots of different discussion groups come together. I think to one that's been a long burning one I've seen and been part of on occasions of like an open app ecosystem and kind of this push towards API-centric development and apps that can communicate with one another, so that we can continue to build the open source web that really serves the kind of future that we want together. And so we do have a public groups feature on Loomio too, so it's anybody's welcome to explore groups that have chosen to make their groups fully public.
Okay.
Although lots of groups do use closed and it's invite only, or they stick a invite yourself link on their website or whatever it is to have a little bit of a door.
Sure.
I feel like one of the important differences between Loomio as a platform and the big social media ones is that there isn't really a focus on your individual identity having like a wall or a timeline, where that's where you get like, you generate accumulate like cultural capital or likes, validation.
Yes.
You don't really have that. You have the group, and it really is driven by the group.
Yes.
You have like a profile, but it's very just like a static thing with like a few details.
Right.
And I think that's a huge difference. I feel like probably that's why going to, ideology and whatever aside, like going to something like Reddit feels very different from going to Facebook.
Yes.
Reddit is also very much discussion or subreddit / group centric.
Yes.
It's not about the individuals and their number of followers and things like that.
Yeah, that was definitely the one that first came to mind when you said that. It was like, because, I've had, for example, I've been a member of the tabletop role-playing game community for a long time. And so it used to be on G+, now mostly on Twitter, but to some extent it's also been on Reddit. And depending on the platform you're interacting on, it can produce a very different community atmosphere. There are very different design goals, and those design goals have effects.
Sorry, just to add one key part of the design goal that's different here is that in Loomio, we've designed an experience to help you feel safe, within your group. And we do hear a lot of people coming to Loomio from the Facebook because they find that Facebook is not so safe for them individually. And of course, the design goal of Facebook is to monetize, your interactions online. That's not our design goal. So, for us, we just have this very simple subscription, and our community price is only $1 a person a year.
Right.
But for that, you avoid being marketed to and having your data sold to advertisers.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. I think one more thing I would say is, while it's great for discussions and many people find it, we do find the groups that really take off on Loomio are the ones who can articulate a common purpose or are working their way towards articulating a common purpose. So there is that bias towards action or bias towards coming together that, like a Reddit has a different dynamic than that, But we see all kinds of groups succeeding with Loomio as well.
Interesting. Okay. So you mentioned earlier that Loomio got started as an open source project. Is it still open source software, or has it moved to a closed source model at this point?
Still open source.
Okay. Interesting. Okay. And the subscriber model of usage has sort of helped to make that viable for you?
Yeah, it has and remains open source today. I mean, we are having some discussions about variations because our intent of open source was to allow, as part of our mission, to allow people to be involved anywhere in decisions that affect them.
Yes.
And that money shouldn't be a barrier towards that. On the other hand, we need to we're running a service through Loomio.org, which comes with real costs and so forth. So that's the service that we are making a charge for, and only a small charge actually. The open source, we're totally happy for people to be setting up instances for themselves, for their own community groups. There are a lot of Burning Man organizations around the world. They're using Loomio for organization, and
or the Yellow Vest movement, or a number,
they're contributing back too by also translating. We've got multiple language translations, and it's come through the communities that have led. So we have a lot of benefit from that. What we're not so happy about is people setting up competitive services,
right?
Using Loomio and setting up as a marketplace with different pricing and so forth. So we haven't seen that so far, and we may have. If we do see it, we've seen some other open source projects having to shift their licenses just subtly to still allow all the things that we want to allow, but just to stop that one avenue of actually creating a competitive model that would that could kill us.
Yeah,
and ultimately kill the software. And the mission. So.
We've definitely spoken on the show before about kind of problematizing or re-examining the existence of open source right now. Just like what is really going to be valuable for smaller scale developers such as yourselves, and ensuring viability into the future, as opposed to just sort of feeding into the material base or the general intellect that is available to enormous mega corporations that also profit from open source. So, I think it's very important to continuously re-examine what the license is providing the organization.
Really the purpose.
Yes.
How do we serve this vision of everybody being able to participate in the decisions that affect their lives? And it's interesting to, we've committed a lot of, Michael and Rob Guthrie, who's not with us, but is with us in a very big sense, our lead developer, 8-9 years, really committing to this and committing down the line to this. So it's like, how do we make sustainable livelihoods around committing to this purpose?
Yes.
And so that's a question, obviously we're interested in people innovating and being in collaboration with folks, but it is, with a small team, it's hard to think about, like, how do you create that sustainability to give a real chance to invest your livelihood into that purpose.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
I think everything we've probably been talking about here is about building an ethical and viable, sustainable business. So we are even the equity structures we talked about earlier. We're not about setting up Loomio for a trade sale to a larger company. We're trying to create sustainability into the future.
Yes.
Yeah.
I know that for many cooperatives, that kind of sustainable purpose is built into a local focus. But you've also found that as a somewhat more distributed organization, that purpose remains for you as well.
Mm. And at the same time, we're working perhaps one of the most competitive markets of the world, global software.
Yes.
Global collaboration software. It's tough business out there.
Oh yeah.
There aren't a lot of rewards for being second.
Right. Right. Yeah. It's it's a very interesting case, absolutely, because as I said, many co-ops are focused much more locally in very different markets. Yeah. Right. So another question I had was, what do you see as the potential for the cooperative movement and the union movement or the workers movement to collaborate? You mentioned before the case of the teachers union here. Are there any other areas you think where there might be potential collaboration?
So I have a labor movement background. That was the start of my professional career. And I worked two and a half years with labor unions, particularly Unite here in the United States. And so I interacted with both service unions and actively organizing unions, and then I got into cooperatives shortly thereafter and have been really interested and focused on cooperatives since then, in kind of all of the different organizations I've helped build up. Mm-hmm. And, I think there's something interesting, in Inspiral we're talking about livelihood pods sometimes rather than even talking about worker co-ops, just to distinguish a social commitment of participants in doing something of like, hey, we want to share income and we want to remove some hierarchy and maybe turn up the collaboration knob. Mm-hmm. But the legal entity is in service of that. So it may or may not be a worker co-op, especially with Loomio is the first worker co-op in New Zealand, and it was work. We had to invest a lot into becoming that.
So, wait, hang on. You're the first worker co-op in New Zealand?
Yes.
Wow.
I only know that I was.
New Zealand actually has a strong heritage, though, in cooperatives, but they tend to be customer-owned cooperatives and supplier-owned cooperatives. Uh-huh. In fact, our largest company in New Zealand, Fonterra, is a supplier-owned cooperative, big dairy company, so owned by the farmers.
Sure.
But I say that to point out that there's these particular ownership structures and there's the principles of cooperativism, which I think are totally compatible with a lot of the healthy ethos of unionism that I've seen coming from the States. And we have actually tons of there's some IWW wobbly groups on Loomio, Democratic Socialists of America on Loomio, which is really awesome to see some of the sort of anarcho-syndicalists come on and see that we are developing federated structure for people wanting to do federated distributed organizing.
Sure.
But yeah, I think the case is interesting. People have so many rigid ideas of what unionism looks like, and a whole range of different experiences, from the really top-down business unions to actually good organizing by the workers and getting some institutional support for industries that have high turnover.
Yes.
And so I think I see, especially if you end up going and talking with the platform co-op folks, I think you'll also see there's a lot of exploration of hey, let's break down some of these really rigid categorical boxes and say look, sometimes it's really useful to have an institution related to help workers across a power differential come to good ends.
Yes.
So yeah, I definitely think there's heaps of potential, but sometimes we get caught up in these namings or structure, particular legal tools, etc.
Yes.
But ultimately, at the end of the day, it's about the relationships, interrogating the power relationships that exist within bigger organizations that are both there when you start, because nobody's starting with a blank whiteboard, and also develop with different abilities, different capacities, different financial situations, etc., different levels of investment.
Right. So, I think it's very much the case that right now, these rigid definitions you mentioned are a little bit in flux. People are interested maybe in unions because they want empowerment in the workplace and addressing those power differentials or problems of inequality. But maybe they're looking for something quite different. Maybe they're looking to achieve certain social justice goals. Maybe it's more about self-management. And certainly, the merger formula that's existed between the socialist movement and the workers' movement is something that people are thinking about right now, but it's not really set in stone either. So I think there's a lot of open room for these kinds of discussions to cross-pollinate and maybe consider different organizational forms. So you mentioned this idea of livelihood pods. Could you just expand on that a little bit more? just to explain what the concept is there?
Yeah, so there's just a number of, I guess, like formations or constellations of humans who are doing work together or doing work in the same field and committing to share income. Mm-hmm. And so it's kind of like a proto-cooperative, or like a cooperative by another name of like, hey, we're in this together. And typically they're associated with some common trade or some arrangement that's directly mutually supporting one another's livelihoods. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, I think just like with Loomio and with Inspiral in general, we're really interested in just, surfacing what's the relationship? How are we committed to each other? How can we do mutual support in practice? How can we make this work to build together?
Right. So it's kind of taking the principles of cooperation and making that a little bit more fuzzy in terms of like what is the exact entity this is going to be. Like this could apply to numerous different sorts of cases.
Yeah, I mean, in Loomio, we really want to make people able to name what it is, or what are we doing together?
Right.
What is the commitment? What does it mean? And so I think that's kind of the instinct is like, we've got to decide how much we're going to invest, how much we're going to commit. We want to make explicit what the risk is with each other.
Sure.
And some of the things you're not going to name because you can't put a price on like trust and having each other's back and stuff like that. But I don't know. We do try to name these things too in ways that, because I want Michael and Greg to know that I have their backs.
Right.
and so, what is the social arrangement or the agreement we can make amongst ourselves so that we can all personally succeed more and succeed together more?
Okay.
Yeah, I was before joining Loomio, I was part of I guess more or less a Livelihood Pod. And we had a financial model that meant we, within constraints, we're able to provide like a basic income for everyone, guarantee a basic income every month. And so we would be pooling a fraction of all our incomes and then redistributing it.
Right.
And it was really interesting because for us, we were a mixture of web developers. We had a designer, a couple, maybe one or two people doing sales. Mm-hmm. And the idea was that we're going to be an autonomous functioning, working group.
Yes.
But also be supporting each other.
Right.
Especially given, the increasingly precarious nature of labor.
Right.
And work. The idea was to supplement and buffer each other against, the kind of typical feast famine cycle of freelancing.
Sure.
Yeah. I think that's different from Loomio, of course, but that's just another example, I think.
Right. Yeah. So there's this a little bit of an idea of mutual work there, but then also mutual aid. Yeah. Okay. Interesting. I would just ask then if there's any final points you would like to mention, any final things you would like to shout out. You've mentioned the Loomio.coop. We'll put that in the show notes. But anything else to talk about here?
Yeah, perhaps just a couple of things of wrapping up. I was just reflecting on your comments earlier, John, about, we have noticed that success in groups depends on having a clear purpose or working towards that purpose, and then figuring out how are you going to work together. Mm-hmm. And that's probably the one thing that we see common across the different groups, whether they're unions or cooperatives or NGOs or even volunteer organizations. The more they're clearer about their purpose and know where they're going, if it's just a general chat room, is less likely to be effective for you. You know, we've designed a set of tools to create outcomes.
Right.
To help you create the outcomes that you're seeking. If you don't know what outcomes you're trying to go for, it's hard to apply that.
Right. I guess that brings a thought to mind for myself, which is like, there's purpose, right? And then there's also getting to purpose,
yes.
right? And you've mentioned that Loomio is sort of designed to get there as best you can facilitate. Is there anything you would recommend in terms of like, here's how to get to purpose, right? Because you're saying purpose is a key to success. So I'm just interested about that.
Yeah, well, perhaps it's it's first of all the recognition that is important to get to there, if it's not already there. And we actually wrote this guide as well, which is part of our help manual called the Guide to Facilitation. And in that Facilitator's Guide, it describes the process of divergence, coming back to convergence. And so we often see that developing as a group is working towards this purpose. So the question starts with an open question, an exploratory, and that's where tools like the survey tools, the polls, so forth.
Sorry, I just booked it from 3:30.
Oh, I'm sorry. We're just finishing up a podcast. Wait a second. Distraction. So this divergence model is one of exploration and an invitation of looking for that, and we have tools like polls, which are one of those tools that can invite people to come in and explore an option, and then when we're beginning towards finding that purpose. There's mechanisms like let's run a temperature check. How do people feel about the situation? And beginning that process towards convergence.
All right. And is that book or document also available at the same location? Or?
It's under help.loomio.org.
Okay, great.
Facilitator's Guide.
Well, it looks like we should maybe wrap things up here. So thank you to all of you very much. I appreciate your time and your contributions very much.
Thank you.
Nice being in conversation with you.
Yeah, thank you.
And we're back.
Yes.
Yep. Good stuff. I love the fucking monsoon that was like going on outside the window. Like, what the fuck was that about?
Oh yeah. Well, so Wellington is notoriously stormy. Like it is called Windy Wellington for a good reason. There's pretty much like, it's not that there isn't a day that goes by without a storm, but it's like there isn't a week that goes by without a storm. You know, it's just constant high winds, and the rain comes in and it just hammers the windows. So that's pretty much what you were hearing in the background. There was classic Wellington weather. It was sunnier earlier in the day, and then as the interview started, it was just boom, hammering the windows right behind us in that meeting room.
Oh wow. That does sound metal. Our denoiser plugin did a valiant job on it, but there's definitely bits where it just gets so much more intense. But hey, it came out pretty good. It's wow, boy, fascinating interview. I found it really interesting that they kind of had that thing of like needing to have serious kind of like organizational strategies and techniques and such to prevent it from falling apart. You know what I mean? Because like it's not like this whole non-hierarchical sort of co-op structure hasn't been attempted before, but there is this kind of like constant risk of it just kind of devolving into a mess. And like they've got it down to an art form, right? Like this. These techniques for keeping themselves on track and also keeping themselves healthy and sane. You know, like it was really impressive that they had they mentioned a couple of times like that this care and attention to people, right? Like in the care of each other and of the people involved, and also the care of the process and the product, because that's this whole business thing is actually what kind of pays our bills ultimately, right? Like it was really fascinating to see that. It was great.
Yeah. I mean, I think both sides of that question are really important because, there's the client relationships, which help to steer the direction of software development. And then there's also maintaining the viability of each of the members, and not locking members into the organization when they don't want to be there, right? So having exit and entry both be reasonably easy to do, I think helps to keep the direction of the cooperative focused, because people have real buy-in to what's going on.
Yeah, I found that it was really interesting the way they had. I kind of forget the details of it exactly, but like it was like the buy-in was not like you're buying shares. Your buy-in is $1 and your buyout is the same dollar, but like you're not sharing in control shares. You're sharing in a stake of in the process. And so it's like they kind of decouple the financial buy-in or the whatever the share buy-in or whatever you want to call it from the like actual decision control buy-in, which was really quite interesting. And it meant that like you wouldn't have somebody who like has more shares or whatever invested than anyone else who would be able to just fucking steer the conversation or steer the company. So like getting someone in is pretty easy, as you said, and getting rid of someone or allowing someone to leave would be pretty easy too. Clever stuff.
Yeah, no. It's really interesting. I thought one of the most intriguing things for me as a Canadian coming in and talking to them was like, first of all, like they were the first producer cooperative in the history of New Zealand.
Amazing.
Which was unbelievable because obviously in Canada, we have quite a strong legacy of the cooperative movement. Because of like, what's often called like prairie socialism. So, in the center of the country, what would be the equivalent of the American Midwest, there is like a really strong and developed cooperative infrastructure that came out of the farmers, right? And what that means is that, well, I guess, there's also quite a strong credit union movement, right? That's also a thing. And what that means is that the definition of a cooperative in Canada is very explicitly encoded into law, right? Like you have the Cooperative Act. That is positive in some ways because it's very there's a very clear legal structure to work with, but in other ways I think it can kind of close down the horizons of your thinking, and so sort of seeing like the innovations they have done in linking up the legal entity to ownership and the constitution of the co-op. I think that's one of the most interesting things I saw at Loomio, because it was like, oh yeah, it doesn't need to be exactly like this. It could be a somewhat different organizational form that's more suited to the goals of the enterprise.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, it was. I think that's something that we need to look into a bit further. The other thing that kind of stood out to me was that that like when you brought up the viable system model stuff, that like they were like, oh yeah, it all when you squint at what we're doing, it basically looks like that in many ways. That like that pattern that we constantly see of like, oh, it turns out that when you use this as a diagnostic framework to look at things, it's like, oh well, highly functional things do tend to fit this template. I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. Like it was really easy to see in the context of that discussion, like how the organization would map onto the VSM. yeah, and how like recursion functions and all that stuff. So that was I guess kind of validating. It's like you go and talk to people who've figured this stuff out like almost entirely without reference to the VSM,
but like,
and then you see it kind of converge.
At least one person there, though, is familiar with the work, but like it's not like they used it to build the company. It was more like they got interested, right? So interesting.
He was a latecomer to the organization. That was John. He's a latecomer to the organization, so obviously his influence on it, its development has been somewhat limited by that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It's definitely a pattern we keep seeing. I found their kind of the continuous planning stuff that they were doing, the stuff that like I think they mentioned like, oh well, what we do, it wouldn't be recognizable as Scrum or Agile or whatever to adherence to those particular doctrines, but it borrows a lot from those. I found that sort of stuff fascinating, and the way that they handle the kind of continuous planning and reevaluation, where it's like you're collectively figuring out what to do for the next couple of weeks, and then you have your check-ins, right, like little demos and like check-in sessions and stuff and such, and then also the admission and the kind of like it being okay that it can just turn out that you need to change direction, that like through no fault of your own, the project that these three folks have been working on for the past 2 weeks is just we just need to change direction, and that's fine, right? Like that continuous course correcting seemed really interesting, right? Like it's that, but it also it seems like it requires that kind of level of co-op kind of trust and mutual support and peership to make that kind of thing possible. Because like although the sort of Scrum, Agile, whatever techniques have the kernel of the possibility of doing this kind of continuous reevaluation, in practice, they usually just end up being kind of fairly top-down directives because they're instantiated in hierarchical organizations. So the plan is almost never self-generated, although it's kind of supposed to be or whatever. But to see these folks doing this, like, really self-generated planning and also being accountable to themselves and each other, and it working really fucking good. 2 thumbs up, really, really impressed with that.
Yeah, no, that takes a clear degree of emotional and otherwise mental maturity to be able to say, okay, we're dropping this. It's something I've been working on, but I understand the big picture here, and we're managing ourselves, so I can't just blow off steam at my boss and feel garbage about it and then go on to the next job, right? Like, part of that, that sort of like homeostat quality of these like flat organizations is that you really need effective ways for people to deal with their thoughts and feelings towards each other and towards the work. That's going to mean that kind of pressure is distributed evenly and it doesn't lead to collapse or breakage or any of that kind of stuff, right? Or downward spirals.
Which is kind of the default, right? In the absence of countervailing structures to push it the other direction. It's the tendency is towards breakdown, right? And that's why taking this kind of organizational stuff seriously is worthwhile.
And it's also that thing that, they mentioned about like, it's kind of operating in an organization without the model of the parent-child relationship.
Yeah.
Right? So it's kind of like operating outside of the extension of the family unit as the paradigm. And so that's, for, I think, most of us, somewhat uncharted territory, right? Because, we obviously have friend groups and collaborate with friends on various things, but, and, maybe we have some basic sort of community organizations we're involved in. But when it comes to like committing day over day, year over year to a productive enterprise, a lot of us don't have that experience, right? It's just, we don't have any idea of what to do when there's no boss to look up to. There's no daddy or mommy to interface with.
Yeah, and like our very concepts of productivity or of doing some sort of productive enterprise are tied to these like hierarchical systems, and we bitterly resent them as we should, right? But then we end up resenting just the like positive activity of doing anything. There's a certain kind of depressive mentality that can come over one from that, right? And it can just be this kind of like rejection of activity itself, because if you only ever experience activity in these hierarchical structures, you'll eventually kind of come to the death drive will take over, and you'll come to loathe activity.
It's sort of an extreme form of alienation.
Totally,
right? It's also just like you come from these patterns of behavior, and even with the best of intentions, it's difficult to deprogram them because you're gonna, it's very easy to reproduce like the abuse that you've suffered, or try to just achieve a kind of familiar environment by reproducing them. Right. So just familiarity being more valuable than anything that's actually good.
Yeah. It seems to be it's the key to understanding how certain structures and systems are autopoietic in this kind of way, like they're self-reproducing, in that they lean on the sort of structure of the human nervous system and the human mind, and how it does tend to reproduce familiar environments for the sake of its own kind of reproduction. But like it's we can create better things, right, and be kind of positive things that are reproduced instead of negative things, and so on.
And I guess that kind of gets back to like that discussion of autopoiesis we had, where these organizational forms can be kind of hyper stable even in the absence of like an established organization, right? Like because we as individuals come to the organization and we bring the patterns of behavior with us, we can reproduce the patterns that we come from, even without that pattern having being enshrined officially in the Constitution or anything like that. It's just, it sticks with you, right? And you reproduce the behavior. So the hyperstability is kind of like beyond even just the legal entity. It's the people.
Yeah. It's the cop in your head, right? Like,
totally.
You're reproducing the law as you go along throughout your day, right? And like, I think we can look to something like The Dispossessed as an example of like a fiction that contains these like subjects that are very different from that, where what they reproduce is the communistic ideals. Like their natural instincts are completely opposed to the instincts of the people from their opposite planet, and so on.
Yeah, so I think that's one of the major ones. Like, just say that it seems like they're being fairly successful in negotiating that problem.
Yeah.
at Loomio, like it's not to say because this phenomenon exists, it's absolutely determining of what can be done, right? Like if you are conscious of that problem, you can start to negotiate it. And it's kind of like that idea in the culture of like them having developed this language over centuries to deprogram capitalism out of their brains, right?
Yeah, like the deliberate cognitive machine engineering coevolution sort of stuff. Yeah, it's doing science on yourself, right, as an organization to do better. Awesome. Yeah, it was really great to see that in action. Do we have anything else to cover? I think maybe another interesting point was the way they slot into the rest of the capitalist system and investment and so on, which was a really interesting peek behind the curtain.
Yeah, I mean, you can definitely see the challenges of existing in the system, right? Because, you know, they got funding from friends and family, which is, you know, many businesses get started that way. That's not super unusual, but moving from there to getting other sources of investment is a major challenge, right? And so they're looking towards private trading, and maybe that means that, you know, they could, say, get investment from some of their clients or something like that. And it is private, so like that, that relationship can be deliberate or can be negotiated on a kind of one-by-one deal sort of way. But of course, there's a major concern that you're introducing capitalism into the organization as soon as you are selling shares to owners who are not workers, right? And it seems as though like they've kind of weighed the risks there and said this can be a bridge to achieving a more sort of viable cooperative economy here, with hopefully other ideas in the future about getting funding, and you know, we're relying a lot on revenue in order to fund themselves, and the subscriber model, right, as a revenue source. All of these things are definitely important, but yeah, I mean, it's definitely a big warning sign or a red flag there that they are introducing capital investors because there just aren't very good alternatives out there, right?
Yeah, I wonder how different that would look if they were in like Spain with Mondragon or something along those lines, right? Or Italy with their you know, fairly well fleshed out cooperative investment infrastructure and so on.
Yes, I think that would look different for sure. There's always the question of like, well, how much are those larger organizations implicated in capitalism? But
a lot.
You have yeah. I mean, you have to negotiate the terrain you're actually on. It's not useful to say, well, we can't have a single iota of capitalism in this organization, and so we're just going to give up.
So that would not be properly materialistic, right? Like as a philosophy, right? Like it would be, oh, you know, if only we could just magically jump track onto this parallel rail where none of these problems existed. Well, yeah, I mean, fucking that would be great. But like all lines of flight begin in the present. Like you are by definition moving. The vector moves from here to there, and like you have to begin from the conditions that you're actually in. So that has to be dealt with, and I think there has to be some sort of ability to weigh up these problems and be able to get your hands dirty, as it were, but also without losing yourselves. And it does seem as if they've really weighed those risks properly and are aware of what they're doing. So that's good.
Yeah, definitely. It's always dangerous to play with fire. It's always dangerous to play with capitalism.
Yeah, but, it's just going to burn your house down.
Well, I mean, you can mix a lot of metaphors there in terms of like, you know, it's basically there's always the danger that it's just going to eat you, right? You do have to be willing to take those risks though. Because, you know, the rest of us who are working as, you know, wage laborers, we're not necessarily very involved in capital investment, but we're still involved in the system. You know, we can maintain a sort of mental separation of being like, well, I'm not a capitalist. It's like true, but we're still involved in capitalism. So if you're making decisions, as worker owners, I mean, there's just a certain degree of like, you have to take a risk of we might lose the organization to those old patterns of behavior, but it's still worth taking the risk.
Yeah, totally. Wonderful. Is there anything else you'd like to cover?
There are a number of links that we'll be including in the show notes.
Yes.
These include things like useful reading resources. They include things like case studies, partner organizations that Loomio has worked with, all that kind of stuff. So that's been kindly provided by Loomio to us. So yeah, check those out for further information. Obviously, so what happened at the end of the interview was that we were actually running overtime and we got booted out of the meeting room. So that's why there was a sudden end to that. And there were just a handful of things that the members wanted to mention, but weren't included in the discussion. And so we'll have those in the show notes for you to check out on your own.
Indeed. Yeah, and I'm sure that'll include a link to their handbook, which is a really good read. They've outlined a lot of how they organize and how they do their thing. Definitely worth checking out. But yeah, all that'll be in the show notes.
Yeah, as well as some other publications they've done in addition to that. So yeah, all worth checking out.
Good stuff. In that case, thanks, listeners. It's been wonderful. While you wait for the next episode, you can find us on the internet. We're on Twitter at GIUnitPod. We're on the web at generalintellectunit.net. We're on all the podcast apps. Like, rate, and subscribe. You know the drill by now. You can also check out our sister shows at Emancipation.Network. We're great buddies with Swampside Chats and From Alpha to Omega. They're absolutely wonderful shows and wonderful folks. Kyle stars over there quite a bit on the From Alpha to Omega show, which is starting to wrap up. Yes, as predicted.
Well, yes, the recordings for Revolutionary Strategy are finished. So that is just like a matter of getting them out there. So that whole recording process, the long march through Revolutionary Strategy has finally ended. And they are now going to be moving on to the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, which is, of course, one of Karl Marx's most famous texts on politics. So we'll have an interesting discussion about that, probably something a little bit shorter. And Swampside did a really good episode recently on sort of rebutting quote unquote tanky or
that was a great
Soviet defensist or
dickheads, as I like to call them.
pro-Stalinist accounts of the USSR and especially of the Stalin era. So I would definitely check that out. That's a good episode for sure.
It was a hot episode. It was. Yeah, definitely. They were great shows. Really fucking good. I have this weird feeling I'm forgetting something.
Patreon?
The Patreon, yes. It's been so long since we've recorded, I've forgotten the outro material. Yes, if you go to patreon.com/generalintellectunit, you can throw us a couple of bucks a month. It really helps smooth over some of the bills and such. But if you support us at the $5 per month level, you get access to our community Discord, which is hopping. There's some really great folks in there. We get to just chat and hang out. It's really cool.
Yeah, even if you just want to lurk and check out what discussions are going on, it's still worth being there.
There's some smart folks,
interesting links.
Some really good links. I can barely keep up with it. But yeah, it's good fun. Am I forgetting anything else? Is there anything else that I'm forgetting? I need to script this thing actually. Finally, after 2 years, I've gotten to the point where I need to script it.
I don't think so. I think we've done the thing. I think there's just Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
That's about it.
Yeah, we've got some hot stuff coming this year. We're planning it out. We're going to start recording all the stuff soon. Don't worry, it's coming. But in the meantime, thanks everyone. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you again in a couple of weeks. Bye-bye.
Bye.